welcome back to another Whiskey Wednesday with Binny's Beverage Depot. I am Pat, along with Brett and Joe from the Whiskey Hotline, as usual. Our guest today is Gordon Motion. Your official title is Master Whiskey Maker at Highland Park, is that right?
Correct, yep.
Okay, and that kind of encompasses all things, I assume, from stillhouse to maturation now for you?
Well, basically, I work in the whiskey quality area, so pretty much anything from new mixed spirit right through to the point it goes in the bottle, responsible for just ensuring the quality right through that. So new spirit, consistency at the distillery, pretty much run by me and the team up there. We check the new mixed spirit quality, check some of the casks as they're maturing, and then put the final vattings together of the different products for Highland Park.
You got your hands in it from start to finish then. How long have you been at Highland Park now?
I've worked with Edrington for just over 22 years.
Wow.
I've worked with all the brands. Yeah, it's difficult to believe, isn't it? Yeah. I've worked with all the brands from Edrington, but more recently concentrated more on the malts and then finally Highland Park. So yeah, we have a few whiskey makers within the company, and we will cover, we don't just deal in our own products, we will cover everybody else's as well, just as and when required, but I'm principally after Highland Park.
Okay. Now, are you on Orkney now, or are you in an office somewhere and you have to go up there regularly?
Unfortunately, I am not on Orkney just now. At the moment, I'm at home. We're having to split work between working from home where we can, and I'm usually based in a blending and bottling plant in the centre of Glasgow.
Okay.
I used to get up to Highland Park maybe 4 times a year, spend a week up there at a time. Really good to catch up with the team up there, just spend time with them. Most of the production from the blending and bottling side takes place in Glasgow, and with obviously the recent events, we're not allowed to travel, so I haven't actually been up to Highland Park since I think last November. Unfortunately,
wow.
A year, yeah, missing it.
Yeah, we're missing Scotland too. We missed our annual Scottish trip this
year.
Well,
it would be, I think this year with the change, because Scotland tends to be a little bit darker anyway because of your northern latitude, and I believe right now there wouldn't be any daylight, pretty much getting close to no daylight on Orkney anyway.
Well, you're coming close to that mid-December. We'll be getting done here about back at 5 o'clock just now, but come winter time, 4 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning before it's fully light. So yeah, they're short days on Orkney.
Yeah, the last time I was actually on Orkney was in May, so it was beautiful because it was pretty much sunny almost all the time.
Yeah, we had some fantastic weather at the start, which I think made the lockdown a little easier for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, Gordon, this is a pleasure for me personally because I've long considered Highland Park my favorite Scotch single malt distillery. I love the array of flavors they get from Highland Park. Obviously, a big component is sherry casks. Has that been a challenge for the distillery recently? I know, the whole sherry cask versus sherry seasoned cask thing has affected a lot of distilleries, a notable other Edrington distillery as well. Where have you seen that in as far as the flavor direction and profile of Highland Park goes, and do you see that changing over time?
It's not an issue. And many years ago, we teamed up with cooperages and bodegas in Spain to get casks manufactured specifically for us, rather than just going out in the open market and trying to buy them. We've probably done that since the mid-80s, when the sherry had to then be bottled in Spain, in Jerez, and the source of casks coming into Britain dried up as a result of that. So yeah, we formed long-term partnerships. We probably buy around 85 to 90% of the sherry casks in the industry. We have them specifically manufactured for us. We have very tight regimes on how the casks are to be made, how they're to be heat treated, what wines have to be used, and to season the casks. So it's not affecting us at the moment. We've got a guaranteed supply of that, and that's something that's critical, particularly for our core single malt range, which are all naturally coloured.
Well, speaking of the core range, I mean, what whiskey do you want to start with first here today?
How about 18-year-old?
Probably 18-year-old. So That was 18-year-old. Now, it used to be, I always used to hear that 18-year-old was a blend of sherry cask and bourbon cask. I want to say, like, I'd always heard 90% sherry cask or something. Is that true, or was I misled for many years?
It's predominantly sherry casks. We fill very few bourbon casks. We have some, a small percentage each year, just to give our future whiskey makers something to play with. But it's predominantly first fill or refill sherry casks. As we go up through the range of ages, you'll find that generally I'll increase the percentage of first fill sherry casks that go in. For the heart of the range, 12 and 18, and we tend towards more European oak, probably in a mix of 3-to-1 European to American. And I'm trying to create something consistent batch to batch, like 12-year-old. For the likes of 21-year-old, which we'll come on to, but we're deliberately releasing different batches and different styles, because for something like a 12-year-old, you've got the entire range of casks available to you, and you probably use 50-60% of your casks for 12-year-old. So you've got less and less as your whiskies get older to play about with. So when you come to 21, 25, 30-year-old, you've got very few casks to play with. So the mix isn't necessarily what you're looking for. So we have to be able to create batch. It just allows me a little bit of flexibility and create something, a different style. Also drives a little bit of collectability for people and a little bit of experimentation as well.
For sure.
So 18-year-old, as I say, predominantly driven by European sherry oak character. It gives it a lovely burnished gold colour. Characteristic of Highland Park. I mean, if distilleries had a terroir, then Highland Park Orkney peat is basically the terroir. I mean, Highland Park is a taste of Orkney, quite literally. The peat on Orkney, I mean, you guys have been to Orkney. For those of your viewers who haven't been to Orkney, it's very windy. There's nothing between America and Orkney except the Atlantic Ocean. So there are very few trees have ever grown in Orkney. And consequently, the peat on Orkney is made principally from low-growing shrubs, heathers, brackens, gorse, these sorts of things. So there's very little woody material in it. And when you burn the peat to dry the malt that we make at the distillery, it's got a very aromatic smoke. If you were to take peat from Islay or St Fergus on the Scottish mainland, they give you a much more ashy, medicinal character to it. The peat that we use to dry the malt at the distillery gives a very floral, fragrant, almost heather honey character, slightly spicy heather honey character. The European oak casks tend to deliver a more tannic character. So you get more sort of dried fruits, raisins, tannas, maybe some dried mixed peel as well from that. Mixed with the slightly spicy, peaty character, you can get hints of chocolate.
You get, and what proportion, because you do your own malting, one of the very few distilleries left that do your own malting for the peated component, and then the non-competed component is brought from the mainland. About what rough proportion do you mix in? Because it's very difficult to walk that line where the peat character manifests itself as a spice rather than overtly smoky.
Yeah. We're aiming for probably around about 35 ppm in the malt. If we can get higher than that, then alter the food. And take the batches of malt that we've made, work out the average we've got in that silo, and we will vary the mix depending on whether we have a silo that we think is quite high in phenols or a silo that's lower in phenols. So we're probably somewhere between 15 to 20%, probably around about 15% inclusion of the typical Highland Park style and the non-peated. So that's coming down to probably about 6 to 8 ppm in the wash, and then you'll probably get about a quarter of that through in the final spirit. So the spirit for Highland Park, we're nothing like the Islay phenol. we're probably somewhere around 1.5 to 2 ppm is where I would like to be in the next one. So it's a
Yeah,
really-
because I say, because for perceptibility, don't you have to, I mean, isn't it, you have to be somewhere closer to 10 for it to start to manifest itself as overtly smoky?
It also depends on the mix of actual phenol compounds that you've got in.
Right.
See, we don't have a lot of woody components, so you're not getting that ashy character coming through. You get a much
Right.
more floral, fragrant peat character coming through in that.
Mhm.
I mean, there's been research at the Scotch Whisky Research Institute into can you, by measuring the phenols in a whisky, determine where that whisky was made from, or where the peat was cut from? And the answer
Right.
was yes, absolutely, you can, because every area of Scotland has will give you a different mix of phenols, so you can quite distinctly pick out Highland Park as being different from everybody else. It's a unique character.
Yeah.
Now, occasionally, we've tasted some Highland Park made malts in the past that have had a bit of an overtly smoky character. We actually had a cask probably in 2007.
We've
I
had
want to
a
say,
couple.
Brad.
I
Yeah.
think we've had a couple, because we did one. It was back when you guys were doing the series of older bottlings in the late 90s through the early 2000s. The first cask that we ever did was a 24-year-old that absolutely had overt peat character. And then we did an independent, I think Signatory had a cask, and we did an independent of a mid-teens that was very overtly peaty.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back. We, years ago, we would say you're going to include 20% malt, regardless of the phenol level.
Right.
So if the kilns were working really well that day, or you got a really good character, there is a chance that the phenol level would vary during production. We've become, we're more environmentally aware and conscious now that we want to try and preserve as much of the peat as possible. If we've got a high level of phenols in our malt, then we'll make that malt last longer to try and keep the level of phenols in the new mix consistent and preserve the peat that we're using as well. So yeah, it's entirely possible that particularly single casks at one day's distillation may well have been more peaty than about it.
Yeah, it's an argument. It's we love single casks. Besides loving Highland Park, we love single casks. So that's always been another argument that it's one more way, as long as you make people know that this isn't what this distillery is going to taste like all the time, but it's one little nuance that floats around that I think, if you tell the story right, combines back into what the distillery character is.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the driving factors behind selection of single casks, and we'll come to that when we talk about Europe. I'm looking at hundreds of casks through the year. I'm looking for something that's different, either a really exceptional example of a first fill sherry cask, or a refill cask that's got a particular character. I mean, you're looking at hundreds of casks, and you will have the sort of vast majority of them in this mid-ground in terms of quality. And every now and again, you'll get one that's completely different, and you think, well, wow, pineapple, where did that come from? I mean, that's not from the New Spirit, and why is it completely different next to it? And it's things like that I'm looking for single casks. It's just something that's a little bit different, either a really good example, or just something that's picked up a really interesting character. So regardless of whether it's a refill cask or a first fill cask or an ex-bourbon or ex-sherry, just looking for something a little bit different.
And you still want the DNA, which is kind of how we love to do these casks, because we still want the DNA to be Highland Park if we're doing a Highland Park cask. You know,
you may find with refill, because it's not putting in so much flavor as a first fill cask, you're allowing that peat character to come through a little more, so that the refill cask may seem or perceived to be slightly more phenolic than first fill casks, which have got a lot of either strong creamy vanilla or rich tannins coming from the European oak.
This is good. Well, this 18, I mean, Highland Park 18 for a lot of people is one of the most defining classic single malts that exists. I mean, this is one of the benchmarks, I think, for the whole industry. It always
Yeah,
has
I
been.
think
And I mean, this is
day in, day out, it's arguably, the best single malt you can get on our shelves. Barring any kind of random cask or something or some one-off. But for stuff that's just that in theory we should be able to walk into a store and purchase on any given day, I certainly put it up there with the best. One of my all-time favorites. I always kind of tell people that you kind of get everything you're looking for in a good single malt Scotch with Highland Park, just because you get fruit, you get a little bit of peat, you get a little bit of sherry, you get all these different flavors that are just so well layered. So it's just like if a caveman got thawed out of the ice and we had to describe what Scotch whiskey was to a caveman, I think this is Scotch. Like this is what I think of when I think of single malt Scotch.
It's not too strong in either direction. It's just to me, it's particularly even the new make spirit is a nice balance of sweet and peat. And that's what I'm looking for. And that's what we're trying to create on all the Highland Park range, is that balance.
Gordon, Charles Stewart asks, Highland Park is located where exactly? You want to answer that one?
It is, it's in the Orkney Islands off the north of Scotland. So about 16 miles off the north of Scotland, there's a group of about 70 islands, 21 of which are inhabited. They are, I think if you ask the inhabitants of Orkney, they would class themselves as Orcadian first and Scottish second. They are very distinct. They were about 1,000 years ago, it was under Viking rule. The analysis of DNA of modern day Orcadians, 1 in 3 have Viking DNA in them. So they are very much proud of that Viking heritage. It is a fantastic set of islands. It's rugged, it's windswept, and when that plane lands on one wheel, as it comes in the strong headwind, and you get out, you do just feel yourself going, ah. It is just a lovely taste of life up there, and it has for a number of years has been voted the happiest place in Scotland, the Orkney Island, and I can see why. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It is. If you haven't been, it's one of those places on Earth that doesn't really look like any place else on Earth except for what it is, because of the lack of trees. And the great, I mean, in a number of great stories, just the from the ferry that comes from St. John of Groats just to Kirkwall. I mean, the bus ride alone, you pass some amazing things from where there were different camps. The story of the chickens that apparently Scotland acquired it from the Vikings as sort of a toss-in because a princess died. And it was sort of thrown in. It's like, okay, well, here, have these islands.
Sorry, we killed your princess. Take some islands. That's how that went.
Well, that was the story. There was there was a gentleman named Martin Duras that was an ambassador for Highland Park for a number of years, and that was always the way that Martin told it. So if that's wrong, then it's a chance to correct the record.
Blame Martin.
So onto the peaty now, because I've kind of moved to, we're talking about, at least for me, a little bit more of that overt peat character. If you want to catch it, I'm trying tasting the 21 right now. And you said that, Gordon, that was from the batch that was produced in August of 2019.
Yeah. It's as I was mentioning earlier, if you're looking at 12-year-olds, you've got just a bit of cask to play with. When you come to 21, we've got a fairly small to us in a particular mix of cask. We released 2 different styles of 21-year-old in 2019, one in August and another one in November, and that was purely down to the amount of stock that had come of age at each time. So the August release had it was first fill European oak sherry cask and first fill American oak sherry cask, and this again that we switched round. slightly, just because of the volume of cask we had. It's slightly more American oak than it is European oak. And that American oak tends to give you a much more creamy vanilla character. Also lets sort of fresh fruit character come through. So I character, but also sort of hints of ripe mango. And again, from the dried fruit of the European sherry cask, we get that orange peel character to it as well. And then you've got the idea in the background, which is the phenolic character, the spices, dry spices, nutmeg. So,
It's really well balanced for as much fruit as there are these complementary spices like you mentioned. And I understand what Brett's saying, where I think the peat does come through a little stronger in this one than the 18. I don't know if it's just not getting as bludgeoned with cherry or not.
yeah,
Well, but
Very nice.
But it's those lighter fruits that you're describing, though. I think that, I mean, that's the genius of the like the subtlety and the nuance that you can get out of a lot of malts from Highland Park, is that in this case that it's only there because it's like a grilled pineapple or grilled mango, right? So it's that combination of the two where you still have the brightness of the fruit along with that little bit of slightly smoky character.
I quite often pick up a caramelized pineapple note from Highland Parks, just depending on the variant and the casks that are used.
Yeah, I get this. I get a little bit of that aromatic sort of smoke on the finish, which is really gorgeous. The thing about both of these, 18 and the 21, for me, is just how wonderfully layered and complex they are, without being brooding. They're just perfect whiskeys.
Yeah, this 21 was really impressive.
And we've got another one coming. Obviously, the volumes that we have of each batch are limited. So we will have another one coming out in the early part of next year. This will be it's actually this year's batch that has been bottled, and it will be released probably December, January next year, I think. So one to keep an eye out for.
Nice. We have a question about kind of the lower end of the range. David was asking specifically how Magnus compares to the 12-year-old.
Magnus has no European oak.
Okay.
It's purely a mixture of first fill American oak and refill sherry cask. So that's driving that real sweet, almost like American cream soda character. The strong vanilla character. So no European oak at all in Magnus.
And I would say the 12-year-old in profile is closer to the 18 then, as far as the oak regimen goes.
Yeah, principally. Yeah, we're about 4-to-1 European oak to American oak. So it's driving more of that tannic character. As Highland Park is natural colour, we have a spec that I'm trying to reach with every batch of 12-year-old that I'm producing. I'm trying to produce it consistently. If we were to use bourbon cask and American oak, I wouldn't be able to get the colour up to what I'm looking for. I need that from the tannic European oak cask. And even they can vary dramatically in the character that you get out. I mean, you get some really cracking dark ones on their own. They're probably too tannic, but as part of the overall batch, they are going to give you the color and the spiciness, and you can balance that out with some of the lighter style ones, and that will give you helps us to keep that natural color up.
No matter what, I always just go back to this 18.
Right. Well, but
I'm a sucker for the 21. It's just awesome.
Yeah.
That grilled pineapple thing on the nose is extra special.
Yeah, it's not something you get out of Highland Park a lot.
Yeah, the subsequent batch that we did, I didn't have, but this was the November 2019 batch. I didn't have American oak sherry cask, so I've used a smaller proportion of bourbon casks in it. they're made with the same oak. They're both American oak. The previous contents have obviously taken different characters out of the wood. Bourbon, being a spirit, is extracting pretty much the same as Scotch whisky would do when it's maturing.
Mm-hmm.
Bourbon casks, being charred rather than toasted, tend to give you a much more floral, fragrant vanilla character. You quite often get coconut, sort of very perfumed notes from bourbon casks, and you compare that with American oak sherry casks, which give you a much more rich, creamy vanilla character. I mean, it's just one of the amazing things about maturing Scotch whisky is they're both American oak, same tree, but just manufactured slightly different, seasoned slightly different, and they give you two completely different characters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you'll find the November release, if you get that, is a bit more fragrant, more perfume than the August release from 2019.
Well, we'll look that. Our Edrington friends watching have to make sure we get some of that when it comes out in November. So the Magnus, so what is it? So you know, we've talked a little bit about the history of Orkney, and you guys have gone through a series of bottlings that have had various different names. You know, you've had the Viking series, you had the Fire and Ice and the different elements series. So what is the significance, just so folks know? You talked about the Viking significance. What's the significance of Magnus in terms of the history of the distillery?
Magnus Jonsson was the founder of Highland Park Distillery back in the 1700s. We say that Highland Park was founded in 1798. In reality, that's actually when he got caught for illicit distilling. So Highland Park, he was a butcher and a church officer by day, and a bootlegger and smuggler by night. He had a small,
well-rounded lifestyle.
Yeah. Whiskey. Yeah, he had a small illicit still up on an area and just not up above Kirkwall, and called the High Park, which is where the distillery is currently situated. It's obviously now called Highland Park. So yeah, Magnus Jonsson was the founder, hence the name Magnus for that whiskey.
Yeah, because there are stories about during his day role as the whiskey's being stored in his church.
Yeah. Hidden under the pulpit.
Underneath the pulpit is a way to hide from the excise man before he finally got caught. So it's amazing too, because with the lack of trees and the lack of everything else, it would be virtually impossible to hide a distillery anywhere on Orkney, right? Well, unless you put it underground in a cave.
Well, at least any smoke wouldn't linger around for long.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Well, we're kind of leading in, and one of the reasons why we were excited on this release and excited to talk to you about it, your background. We have, you know, we were blessed with the ability to do Highland Park casks more than 15 years ago when there were a series of them coming out, one of which was actually the Whiskey Advocate Whiskey of the Year in 2006, I believe. We won that award, and we're actually should by all rights have won it the next year, but they didn't feel it would be appropriate to give it to a retailer single cast 2 years in a row. And that would have actually been the third year in a row that Highland Park would have won, because the year in 2005, the Whiskey of the Year, I believe, was the Highland Park 30. And then the Binny's cask. And then we tied and lost the tiebreaker to a Glenlivet 74, I think, the next year.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, and you mentioned just managing stocks and having, you need for the distillery bottlings to continue on, you obviously need to manage your stocks in such a way you can ensure you have all the tools you need to develop the regular bottling. So the ability to do single casks disappeared. That's resurfaced in the last couple of years, and you know what we have in front of us now is a blessing that it has resurfaced, at least for us.
It's certainly changed. The single cask we did, again, I was involved with it back sort of early days in the career. We were looking for, you know, we had been asked for really good sherry casks, and at that point we don't have the tools available to us now to look forward and say, you know, can we, you know, if we start using these, can we produce 12-year-old in 6-7 years' time, or are we going to be eating up the best casks? So we had to put a stop to that at that point. Certainly on that style. This latest range that we're doing is a mix of casks. I mean, you'll see refill hogsheads, you'll see bourbon casks, you'll see first fill sherry casks there, but it's not just all first fill. We have a much better handle on we have a good handle on what stocks we've got. We have a better idea of what our budgets are going to be going forward. And that's a big part of my job, is actually making sure that, you know, when I finally hand my Highland Park, I'm leaving a legacy. I'm covered. The cask we've got is, as we would say in Scotland, is an absolute sweeter. It's cracking. It's a first fill European oak hogshead. 2006 cask number 5046. It was distilled in August 2006, and it spent its entire life until we go down to Glasgow for bottling. It spent its entire life in Warehouse 25. So Warehouse 25 is the northernmost Scotch whisky warehouse in the world. That product placement there, there we go. It's absolutely, unfortunately, I just get these little bottles of it. I don't get it.
Well, we had to, just in case the local people tried to like sell us something, you know, they just, so we didn't get a bait and switch, we kept our sample too.
But yeah, you can see the color. That is, I'm looking for the first fill European sherry cask. It's a real deep ruby color. Now, most of my working life, I spend diluting whiskies and nosing them at 20%, but with this one, at 63%, 63 and a half, it's bottled at.
Yeah.
Yeah, 63.5.
I mean, again, from a professional point of view, if I was tasting that, it would either be down to 30 or 20% for tasting and writing tasting notes. From a sort of personal preference for consumption, I will put a spot of water in, and everybody is entitled to do that. It's your whiskey.
Oh yeah.
It's just a bit
Where,
for me, 63. So I'll take it down to somewhere between 40 to 50% to consume it.
Gordon, where would this have been filled? Because 63.5 has to be pretty close to the fill strength when the barrel was filled now 13 years ago.
It was filled up at the distillery. We've over the years, depending on who we're filling for and where we've been warehousing, we've filled anywhere between 63.5 and 69.5%.
Okay.
We're currently filling just above 69%. It saves us a little bit on space and casks for one thing. You get more extract, more extracted out of the casks at that strength, but not the increase in proportion that relates to the increase in strength. So if I were to take that down to 40% for something like a 12-year-old, I would actually end up with slightly less colour than I would if we filled at 63.5. But for something like a single cask, you're getting absolutely everything out of that cask. I mean, real rich tannins, dried fruit character, a nice light toasted oak character to it as well, and that gentle peak, typical of Highland Park.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that it's interesting you talked about that, because I think that the debate doesn't seem to rage anymore, but there would have been a time, especially once you got into the 80s and into the late 80s and early 90s, about fill strengths. I think you know, in the United States it's actually regulated.
Yeah.
That you can't go in at more than 62.5%. You know, in Scotland it's not regulated, and I know there was a time when DCL was filling casks at 70 plus, the argument being that we conserve space. The argument against, and why I think the fill strengths have come down, is that yes, but water's cheaper. Well, one argument, the crass argument, is that water's cheaper than whiskey and we can just add in, you know, water. But I think that it's interesting that this would work as well if you had to cut it and add water. Because don't you think the more water you have to add from high strength down to bottling strength, there's a danger of stripping some of the character the cask gives versus already being close because it's been filled to lower strength?
Well, but we try our best. I mean, we've spent years putting that flavour in, getting the flavour the way we want it.
Right.
And yes, if you are to chill filter and go too extreme to chill filtration, you will strip something out. It seems to me that when all that effort put in to strip it out at the last possible moment where you put it in the bottle. And that's one of the other sort of keystones of Highland Park is our cask harmonisation for our main brands like the 12-year-old and the 18-year-old. I'll create the batches, the battings of 12 and 18-year-old, and we will add water and take it from its cask strength down to just around 46%. And then we let that sit for another month, and that allows all the different characters in the cask to meld together. More importantly, it allows the water and whiskey to interact, and the flavour compounds in the whiskey. Just around about the 46% is where you see, as you reduce it down from 63 to about 46%, it will stay fairly clear, and then at 46%, you'll see the haze suddenly appear, and that's the point at which these flavour compounds are no longer soluble. They're soluble in alcohol rather than water, and you've added too much water effectively for them, so they come out of solution. If you were to take your strength from 63 down to 40 in one go, that comes out of solution. You filter it at that point, and what you're trapping on the filter paper or the filter sheets is some of the flavours and some of the things that will give you mouthfeel, fatty acids. By leaving our whiskey to marry or harmonise for a month, you allow the interaction between the water and the compounds to settle down a little bit, and some of those compounds will redissolve back into whiskey. And if they redissolve back into whiskey, they're not going to trap in the filter sheet. Now, I was in a local bar a number of years ago, and one of our locals was drinking a competitor's product, and I said, "Have you not drunk one of ours?" And he says, "I did try it once, but it's just too oily for me." And well, that's disappointing that you don't like it, but I'm actually quite heartened that you actually. So, yeah, we chill filter at +4 degrees centigrade, which is actually quite warm. We're really just, all we are doing for the chill filtration is to make sure that if that whiskey bottle sits in a warehouse at 4 degrees, it will not go cloudy through a chill haze. If you store it below that of time, it will go cloudy, but it's reversible once you want that. So by doing the two-stage reduction, the cask harmonisation for a month, it allows us just to be as gentle as possible when we're filtering and try and keep in as much flavour as possible. Right. So from that point of view, whether you filled at 69 or whether you filled at 63 becomes less relevant.
Mm-hmm. Right. And actually that we need to make sure we keep that recording, because that's one of the best descriptions of the pros and cons of chill filtration and how to work around, chill filtration, because that for us is a big issue. We prefer as many things as we can get at a batch strength so we don't have to chill filter. And if we do projects that are just Binny's related, we would never take them below 46 also, so we don't have to, because we can explain. It's easier for us because we have much more control to explain why something might look a little bit hazy, and make sure people understand that hazy is good, hazy isn't bad.
Mm-hmm. There are certain markets where you can't have any form of haze in it at all. I mean, Russia is one of them. If you ended up chill haze because it's stored in a cold warehouse, they will send the whiskey back. So we have to make sure that our whiskey remains bright and clear. But we want to do that and leave in as much flavour as possible.
Gordon, sorry to backtrack a bit. My internet was cutting out when you mentioned the warehouse that this 12-year was stored in. Can you go over that again?
It was stored in warehouse 25. We have a number of dunnage warehouses, which are the low stone built, low roofs. Casks are stored 2 or 3 high.
Like the one behind me.
Yeah, yeah, and we have 4 racked warehouses, which are 7 tiers high, and 25 is one of the racked warehouses. It's right down at the bottom corner of the Highland Park site, but it's also the most northerly Scotch whisky warehouse in the world.
Cool.
So this cask has spent its entire life up until I think the back end of 2018 when we selected it as a single cask and we brought it down so that it was ready for us to bottle. It spent its entire life up at the distillery, maturing in that cool maturation. Orkney is, for the fact that it's very windy, it's actually got a higher average temperature than the warehouses in Speyside. And it doesn't really change much from about 2 degrees to 16 degrees winter to summer. They just don't get the extremes of temperature that you get in this central area of Scotland, where we can get down to minus 16 on occasion. So yeah, the extremes. So consequently, it's a slower maturation because the temperature is not fluctuating as much, and you don't get the whiskey getting pushed into and sucked out of the cask quite as much. So it's a slower, gentle maturation that takes place in Orkney.
We had 2 questions, one from Facebook. Somebody asked if there's anything on the horizon as a potential replacement for my favorite non-age stated ever, Dark Origins.
Dark Origins was using a lot of first fill sherry casks. So at the moment, it was unsustainable in the long term. Just again, it was like going back to the single casks from the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
We were putting an inordinate amount of first fill sherry, and it wasn't sustainable in the long term. So maybe as a one-off or a limited release, never say never, but it certainly won't be an ongoing large volume product.
Just not sustainable. And then Charles Stewart asked another question. Which Highland Park would you recommend for a recently converted single malt drinker / collector? Well, I'd say as a collector, this Binny single cask is going to be a treasure for years to come. For a recently converted drinker, I would personally start with the 12, as it's the house whiskey in my house. I always have 2 bottles of Highland Park 12 in my house because the friends come over and we open one. It usually gets finished, and so you got to have a backup. I don't know where you stand on that, Gordon.
Yeah, only 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, 12-year-old is it's an excellent introduction. It being just that light, gentle peat. It's not. I mean, if you were to introduce somebody to Scotch whisky and give them an Islay, they might either love it or hate it, and they might never drink whisky again. But yeah, this is a kind of. I was described by Michael Jackson as the greatest all-rounder, and it is just that nice balance and sweet character. So yeah, go for the 12-year-old to start with, and then just experiment. We've put out all sorts of characters. If you want to try 100% ex-bourbon maturity, look at something like Full Volume. If you want to try 100% first fill European oak sherry, then Highland Park the Dark was done in that. So I've tried to do different characters for each one. So yeah, experiment.
Well, and even when you get into older expressions, like you said, which it was very enlightening for folks that the series of 21s that are coming out, while it is, it seems to be turning into a little bit of a standard release, there are variants or variation that you openly talk about. If you're really trying to maintain some level of consistency with 12 and 18, 21 is an opportunity to have something consistent. The 25-year-old single casks were for a long time like that as well, because they were truly single barrel releases, right? A lot of the 25s.
Yeah, I go back to when I joined the company in 1998, and we had 12, 18, and 25-year-old. Just started releasing 25-year-old, and the number of versions of Highland Park that have been over the years. That's why we need better tools to predict what stock we've got and how we're going to use it in the future. And the real challenge for me on, as you say, on the likes of 12 and 18-year-old is keeping them consistent year on year, batch on batch, year on year. And to have a little bit of flexibility to go play with the older ages, 21, 25, 30, 40-year-old is great. I can look at the stock. I don't have to worry about consistency as long as the quality is consistent.
Sure. Yeah. I'm looking forward to the next 21 because the 21 we tried earlier was beautiful.
Beautiful.
And I'm looking forward to the next the next opportunity to do a Binny single cask.
Yes.
How many of you guys released so far?
Well, this would be with a very, very long gap. This would be our 5th.
Good.
Yeah.
We did a 74, a 71, 34, 73, 33, 81, 24, and 81, 25-year-old.
Yeah.
Oh, it was actually went 81, 24, 71, 34, 73, 33, 81, 25.
Yeah.
Were the 4 that we did in the early 2000s.
So yeah, long gap, but I'm definitely ready for more cask samples. I'll put it that way.
Yes. Yeah, this one is. How are we doing on this? Let's look and see. I think this is disappearing pretty quickly for those of you that are interested in grabbing a bottle of this cask. Yep, you got to get it now. Get it now. It's about half gone.
Yeah.
High evaporation rate cask.
Exactly. So Gordon, how many bottles of this typically? How many bottles of this did you guys hold back just for research purposes?
Well, every bottling that we do, I'll keep. There'll be 2 samples drawn, two half-liter samples drawn, one for the lab to do analysis and one for us to keep in the library. So we've got a 500 ml sample, which is where I managed to get the sample for this afternoon. So there's only 400 ml of that left. And I think we may keep 1 or 2 bottles back for reference for our historical library as well, of finished pack. But virtually every bottle goes out to you guys, to the customers.
Yeah. No, it's nice. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, Gordon, this was great, man. Really appreciate your time today. Always fun to talk about Highland Park, obviously, personally. But when you have whiskeys of this quality, you know, the conversation tends to create itself, I suppose. You can see how many people joined us at, 11 a.m. local time to talk and taste Highland Park. It's a privilege working with whiskey of this quality. It really is. So we really appreciate your time today and talking about this stuff. And hopefully we'll have another cask and have to have you on again.
You're welcome. Good to chat with you guys.
All right. Well, cheers, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Brett and Joe and I will be back next Wednesday evening with the new master distiller from Jack Daniels. So until then, everybody have a safe weekend. Stay safe and cheers. Thank you. Thank you, Gordon.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.